Good afternoon and a big welcome to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining and welcome to the final session on day 2 of our Risk Management Summit. I hope you've enjoyed lots of our sessions so far over the last 2 days and gained lots of useful insights. So I'm Chris Boyle, Practice Director for Identity and Access Management at Turnkey Consulting and your host for this session. It's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Mark Oldroyd from SailPoint, who are the global leaders in identity governance. Today, Mark will be talking about the power of the Identity Cube. To give a brief background to this, based on what we see in the market time and time again, is one of the fundamental challenges that all organizations have is understanding who has access to what system within their organization. So there's a simple question that's always asked in every access related audit. And I've been involved in addressing quite a few of these in my 20 years in identity and access management. And it's often one of the hardest questions to answer. And that question is simply this: who has access to what? Now, this is a question that typically takes a lot of time and effort to answer for most organizations. For example, all of the system and application owners having to produce reports and consolidate and correlate this access in their system against real people, thus costing the organizations lots of time, money and effort. And this isn't also a one-time thing. This is an annual occurrence as part of any audit. This is also the first in a long line of questions that organizations will be asked. So just a follow-on question. It's great that you know who's got access to what system, but within each of those systems, is that access appropriate for that person's job role? So enter the role of the manager and then typically having to look at lots of spreadsheets with data they possibly struggle to interpret and confirm if their team need this access. Again, over and over again on an annual basis, or depending on regulation, it may be more frequently. But let's be clear, this isn't just highly regulated industries. This is something that is a pain point and a burden on business users the world over. Again, this is just the start of what can be achieved, but if we could take away that pain, that effort, that burden, and most importantly, the costs associated with it. So we have Mark here to tell us how access governance can help alleviate that burden and enable the business instead. The main topics Mark will be covering are around how identity governance is reaching maturity as a technology in many sectors, but how organizations really leverage the true value of these solutions. He'll also discuss the benefits of the information that is captured during governance activities and how this is represented in the SailPoint world, which is known as the Identity Cube. And then finally, Mark will go into more detail about what an identity cube is and how it can help you unburden your business. However, that's enough from me. I don't want to steal any more of Mark's thunder. So without further ado, oh, hang on, sorry, one last thing before I forget. We will have a question and answer session at the end. So if you want to ask anything, please do type your questions into the comment section of the Zoom meeting. So thanks, and so now that really is it from me. I will hand over now to Mark. Mark, over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah.
So great. Okay. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the SailPoint presentation. Thanks, Chris, for the great introduction, and also thanks to Turnkey for inviting me and SailPoint along here today to talk on the Virtual Risk Management Forum. My name is Mark Oldroyd, and I'm responsible for partner enablement at SailPoint across our EMEA region, and I've been doing that for around 8 years now. So in today's presentation, I'd really like to look at the concept of identity, as Chris highlighted, and the Identity Cube, which is a term coined by SailPoint a few years ago to describe the information we hold about users and their access, and support some of the things that Chris was just taking us through there. Identity cubes ultimately build into a repository of individual user context and access rights across the IT landscape. And we'll look at why this is beneficial, we'll look at how it can be achieved and maintained, and more importantly, what value it can add to the pressures and challenges faced by organizations today. So if we begin, if I can move my slides, if we begin with a bit of a background and some context, and we'll build the story over the next few slides. However, we're kind of starting at the end of the presentation here. What I want you to hopefully understand is how powerful the concept of the Identity Cube can be for your organization. Gaining comprehensive, up-to-date visibility of the access that users have across your applications, your cloud services, your collaborative data stores, and your infrastructure components, and then combining this with identity attributes and business context of the user really provides a compelling foundation that can be used to enhance your security posture and support company initiatives and many IT programs, as we'll see later in this session. In the next 30 minutes or so, we should see how this can be achieved in your organization. But first, let's touch on the problem of security. And it seems like every morning we wake up, we read about a new breach. This week is no different. We're almost becoming quite desensitized to some of these big numbers. In the year 2019 alone, there were over 5,100 data breaches, resulting in a total, as you see there on the screen, of 7.9 billion customer records exposed. Now, this was 33% up on the previous year, 2018. And this is all based on research from Risk-Based Security. And obviously, we're on track to increase that again this year. That's typically what is happening. And this is really just the ones that were reported and publicized. Just imagine what the real number is, what the actual number is out there. Now, the average cost of a breach to these organizations back in 2019 was around $3.9 million per breach. And that's direct costs, things like investigation expenses, damage control, repairs, lawsuits, and obviously fines. So what we're talking about here, is a big amount of money. We know from previous assessments that the impact typically equates to around $148 per record, per customer record. Again, according to the Ponemon Institute studies, and with 7.9 billion records, that's almost $1.2 trillion that we're talking about there of costs related to these kind of exposures. That's a huge burden to businesses. Now, it only takes one incident or one identity, one access to be compromised for an entire organization to fall prey to this. And when you look at the source of the breaches, again, there's lots of studies on this. You look at the source of the breaches, it becomes fairly apparent that insiders are quite a significant factor in all of this. And depending on the research, somewhere between 30 and 45% of all breaches are actually a direct result of malicious or accidental or even hijacked access to sensitive data. And the amount of data we store on and off premise is increasing exponentially. We all know this. And that, coupled with the changes in the way we work today and how we're going to work in the future, is actually making the job of protecting our data more and more difficult. It's a big problem, and it's only going to get worse. So we all know the reasons why managing user threat is difficult. It's because the user population is constantly churning or changing. Now, business growth can significantly increase the complexity and the scale of managing these users and the resources we have in the enterprise as we add more people through acquisition or just natural growth of the organization. In addition to the traditional user types we see for employees, contractors, suppliers, and business partners, we're now seeing IT environments where users are no longer just humans. Okay, organizations are embracing RPA or robotic process automation, Internet of Things, and the devices that support that, and even software bots or robot accounts. And they're granting these users access to increasingly sensitive data and systems in order to support the new challenges at a much faster rate. And if we adopt their use unchecked on a large scale, they can represent significant risk of data exposure. And while we're on the subject of users, it may not always be about adding more users to the population. perhaps the title of this slide should have read more user change instead of more users, because we see large-scale changes to these employee groups, and in some cases the accelerated loss of employees, like we've sadly seen in recent months due to the pandemic. Those kind of bulk activities can again put the same strain on our systems. So in addition to that backdrop of managing the user community, the insider threats that we talked about, and the potential data exposure that we all recognize, today's organizations also have to deal with a constant challenges from both the business and the technology worlds. And many of you will be well aware of these challenges and could well be in the process of delivering some of these initiatives to your own organizations. Some of these challenges, like digital or cloud transformation, and the programs that come along with them, are actually becoming commonplace as most of us start to take advantage of the new technologies delivered from the cloud. Perhaps we're being forced to adopt cloud due to the evolution of the technologies that we use. And a good example of that is SAP's push from on-premise to the new S/4HANA cloud solution. Other challenges have reared their head more recently, such as the need to quickly move the majority of our employees out of the office and into remote home working environments. So again, these challenges sometimes appear very quickly. Some of them build up over a period of time. Now, all of these business and technical challenges typically result in constantly changing IT environments. And for example, that recent switch to home working that we talked about has resulted in many organizations deploying huge amounts of technology very quickly, often delivered as cloud services to benefit from speed and reduce cost. And much of this has been delivered without the typical security considerations we would normally apply. Corners have been cut, and we know this, in the race for speed over perfection. In user access terms, perhaps some organizations didn't approve or validate what actually represents correct access in this new working environment. Some organizations may have even removed approval processes entirely for access requests in order to get people working as quickly as possible. So the result of all of that change is that facing these challenges typically results in more technology being added into the infrastructure over and above what is already there. And in many cases, we have parallel technologies, at least for some interim period. Every one of these applications and services needs to be managed and governed in order to protect the business from internal and external risk, as we've discussed. These new technologies could be application platforms, things like ServiceNow or Salesforce, or they could actually be more complex cloud-based infrastructure platforms, such as AWS or the Google Cloud Platform, which are in many cases less familiar to organizations. Not only do these apps and services need to be governed and managed, but more importantly, organizations need to be able to quickly and efficiently bring these services into production to enable the transformation to happen at the speed that is demanded by the business. And with the application sprawl comes an even bigger kind of untamed web of data, both unstructured data held in file stores and structured data, which is obviously sitting in application repositories. The former of those, the unstructured data stores, is currently one of the biggest blind spots that organizations have. And that is obvious when organizations primarily use on-premise storage. It potentially gets much worse when organizations move to cloud-based storage and collaboration. Simply identifying and managing even just the critical and sensitive data in your on-premise data stores is a huge challenge for most organizations. How many organizations are currently replicating that sensitive data into cloud-based repositories to facilitate new channels of information sharing? And we're seeing solutions like Box, Dropbox, SharePoint, Microsoft OneDrive, and many others being adopted to support these rapidly changing business environments. How many of those organizations using those tools, are actually governing access to the data stored in those cloud facilities? Are they able to locate and control the sensitive data, even if they couldn't do that on premise? So obviously, this is again providing an underlying challenge to all of the things we're trying to do. So to summarize all of that, adapting to these business challenges is helping organizations to grow and to stay competitive and to become more agile. But along with that transformation comes more users that organizations have to manage, or different types of users as well, more applications coming on board at an accelerated rate, and an explosion of data that we're storing. What does this all mean to organizations? Well, it actually means an increase in the risk profile if we don't manage and govern all of this effectively. So where do we start on our journey to both address these challenges and at the same time manage the potential risk that we can see? Well, we can actually use identity governance and the concept of the identity cube to help us. And let's go back to some basics here. Identity governance is about helping organizations tackle some critical questions. And first of all, where is our sensitive data? Let's not boil the ocean. Let's start by understanding where we store the most critical and valuable information that drives the business. What kind of data do we hold? How is this being proliferated around the organization? How is it being shared inside and potentially outside the organization? All information that we need to know before we start our journey. Secondly, we need to understand, as Chris outlined in the introduction, who currently has access. And this is a complex question. Who are the users in our environment? What is the relationship they have with the business or the organization? Which applications and services can they access? What rights do they have in those applications? And last but not least, what access do they have to this sensitive information that we've identified? And when we've been through this process and we can answer this question, that is what leads us to the creation of the identity cubes themselves. Once we've answered that complex question, we then have a set of cubes. We can start to test whether the access these cubes hold is appropriate for the user's job function and for their relationship with the business. And for this, we need a myriad of tools and approaches, all of which are aimed primarily at getting the business involved in the decision-making process and ensuring ultimately that users have only the access they need at that point in time. And this is another concept you will hear at something we call least privilege, minimizing user access to the absolute minimum. And finally, we want to know that the access these people hold that is represented on the cubes is being used correctly in accordance with their expected job function. Any deviation from this may indicate inappropriate access, malicious intent, or perhaps even a data breach that is in progress itself. The job of the identity cube is to represent all of the information I've mentioned here and the activity in a way that we can easily consume to support our IT and our business initiatives going forward. So let's go back to the IT landscape that I just talked about. Given all that is happening in today's organizations and the rate of change that we see and that we need to keep up, to keep pace with our competitors, how can we quickly adapt and bring on the new technology that we've talked about, but still retain the high level of protection that we desire? Well, the answer is really hidden in the identity cube itself. Understanding the evolving user population, the access those users hold, the services that are available, and what users need to perform their job function gives us a foundation for managing this change and allows us to adapt quickly while retaining the control and reducing the potential risk. This may sound easy, but how do we do this? How do we approach this problem of the identity cube? Well, we have to go through a fairly intensive process to get to the full level of maturity that I'm talking about. but we can start simply by understanding our users better. Constructing the repository of identity cubes really begins with a basic discovery process. The identity information related to our employees and possibly our contractors and other temporary staff is more than likely resident in our HR or HCM applications. Whether they're on-premise or in the cloud, it really doesn't matter. Extracting elements of that data for each person, using it to construct the initial face of our identity cube, and then putting in place a synchronization process to keep that information updated gives us the first deliverable on this journey. Even at this stage, we may face some challenges. And one common challenge is finding an authoritative source of information for our temporary or contract workers. Quite often they're not in the HR system, and we have to look at where they're actually recorded, if anywhere. There are approaches we can use to formalize this and get control of that community of users as part of this process. But ultimately, this discovery is the beginning of our Identity Cube repository. Once we have the basic cubes in place, we begin to enhance this content by aggregating the accounts and the permissions held by our users across the entire set of IT applications and services. And this really involves building connections into those services, collecting access data and correlating this back into the individual cubes, and slowly building up a picture of user access. And during this process, we already start to see some benefits coming out, such as cleaning out unused orphan accounts and perhaps some unnecessary access as we go. The key to all of this is connectivity. You need a solution here that is able to deal with both legacy applications and new technologies and support our environment as it evolves. So moving on to the next step, another face of the cube involves understanding the data that each user has access to as well as the applications. Analyzing our collaborative storage solutions, such as OneDrive or some of the icons you see on the screen there, or even our regular server-based storage that is sitting in our file and print environment, will not only show us what users have access to, but it will also help us to highlight the locations of sensitive or critical content that needs to be protected. And finally, augmenting the cube with security-related access controls adds yet another angle to the information that we're holding in the cube itself. Access to things like privileged account management solutions, the contents of the single sign-on launchpad for the user, administrative rights, bot or RPA accounts that they're responsible for. All those things we discussed earlier can all be linked into the cube structure to give us a comprehensive view of user access across the entire estate, including the security infrastructure that we have. Once we've got to that point and the Identity Cube repository is defined and built, we now have an effective platform on which to construct our, shall we call them, risk reduction frameworks. Simply analyzing this data in the cubes, or perhaps going one step further and asking our business community to assess and judge what we found, allows us to quickly move towards a more refined and appropriate access model for our users. Applying near real-time policies based on toxic combinations of access or patterns of activity allows us to quickly identify and remediate inappropriate access that increases our risk posture. Tagging and monitoring the most critical and sensitive data, as I mentioned earlier, and monitoring who has access to that data wherever it is located, again, helps us to reduce the potential risk of malicious or accidental exposure. And let's not forget the potential increase in our administration efficiency and productivity of our users once we start to automate the provisioning of access for new starters, automatically adjust appropriate access for users as they change job function and move around the organization, and also handle termination of leaver access. And we can do all of that using things like business role modeling and automated workflows and other mechanisms. So obviously some benefits to getting through that process and getting to that maturity level, and that is something we can do very quickly. These are all mechanisms that can be applied once we've got the identity cube concept and the repository of cubes in place. What we've discussed so far is absolutely achievable with today's governance technologies. And SailPoint in particular has been driving the vision for this space with the introduction of identity governance solutions as far back as 2007, revolutionizing the provisioning market back in 2010, and latterly introducing SaaS-based or cloud-based identity governance a few years later, and finally adding things like data access management as part of a comprehensive identity platform. To continue to push the boundaries of what is possible, we're once again advancing the market into a new world of artificial intelligence-driven identity. And this is what we call the SailPoint Predictive Identity Platform. It's a service-based approach. Many of these services may be familiar to you, but others on the screen represent our significant investment into the world of artificial intelligence and machine learning. But I don't want to talk about technology really today. We want to talk about what this means to business and to risk management and security in particular. What it means is that using these kind of approaches, we can actually go further. Let's think about the Identity Cube repository that we just discussed. We've been through the process, we've constructed our cube, we've hooked everything into our existing environment. We now have a set of identity cubes representing our users and their access. At first glance, all the cubes in our company might look basically the same. Just as traditional approaches to IT security treat all users the same, governance solutions typically also apply the same policies and restrictions to users across the board. And this can lead us to a lack of focus. It's quite easy for governance processes to maybe miss something significant, which ultimately leads to an increased risk for the organization for all the reasons that we've talked about already in the session today. A truly intelligent governance framework can actually keep a watchful eye trained on the user population. But if we take a closer look at those users, we actually see that perhaps they're not the same. Perhaps they have slight variations in their access based on factors such as geography or job function, or perhaps the markets that those people support and operate in. And you will find that there are users in the community who have the potential to impact the organization's risk profile as well, perhaps in a small way, maybe in a more significant way. Perhaps there are users who have conflicting access rights, as we've mentioned, highly toxic combinations that open up the potential for insider threats, insider fraud. Perhaps there are users who show a slightly elevated potential for risk due to their strange activity patterns or other things that we recognize about those people. If we begin to apply some advanced AI techniques, then we may start to understand and manage these users or these identity cubes in a much better way. Something called peer grouping allows us to identify collections of cubes that have similar characteristics or similar entitlements or similar access, but more importantly, similar levels of risk. And as changes happen, peer groups are continually analyzed and reevaluated so that we obviously maintain the most up-to-date view of our user population. Ultimately, these peer groups can be used to define dynamic business roles and other policies and restrictions, and obviously used to minimize risk through a much better understanding of user behavior and user requirements. And obviously in this case, we see things like the high risk group here. These will obviously be the targets of more comprehensive access review processes and other things as well. During this process, it should become easier to identify what we call outliers. Now, these are people with unique or odd access rights, or perhaps odd behavior. and they're cubes that we can highlight specifically. And we can deal with these cubes accordingly through increased attention and additional controls. Now, this approach is really taking the governance of our users, our applications, and our data to the next level, and really enabling the organization to face the challenges we discussed earlier with minimum impact on the risk posture and maximum impact on the business capability. So let's go back and just touch on some of those challenges that I highlighted earlier, and let's see what we can do to support some of them. And if we take the topic of the agile workforce, okay, supporting large numbers of remote workers does not have to compromise your security procedures. Introducing new cloud technologies such as collaboration tools, things like Zoom and Microsoft Teams have been popular quite recently. These can be quickly rolled out to our users by simply onboarding them into the governance solution, adding the appropriate access rights to the existing role structures, and letting the automated governance process generate accounts and access levels that are relevant to each user. Working from home to reset a forgotten password or perhaps request access to a new application does not require calls to the help desk or visits to site. If we provide cloud access to these functions, underpinned by a comprehensive view of the user's current access, which we have in the Identity Cube, we also know what is appropriate and what is allowed. We can greatly simplify this process and ensure we keep the same levels of productivity and security while supporting the new working environment with our users, working remotely from home, etc. Another challenge that many organizations face is managing and effectively processing the huge and growing amount of security incidents that are captured by the typical SOC or Security Operations Center. It's becoming increasingly difficult to sort through events to identify the real problem areas. And the Identity Cube concept can help here too. Using identity information, it's possible to increase the efficiency and the effectiveness of your security operations. Just think about the benefits of enriching the security alerts with business context information from the cube. Simple things like where is a user located, what is their job function, or a role explanation would potentially help to remove false positives and validate the security events even further. When a true anomaly is detected, current security operations usually results in some kind of alert or notification being sent out. But what if we use the Identity Cube to drive active remediation of that situation? For example, disabling all the accounts held by a user temporarily as a result of a detected breach in the SOC, or perhaps triggering an access certification or review of a user's entire access as a result of some inappropriate behavior out of hours that we pick up through our event management system. So a number of things there that we can help with. Another major initiative in many organizations is around digital or cloud transformation. And I'm sure you've heard lots about this in the forum today already. Globally, 84% of enterprises are moving their workloads into cloud-based infrastructure as a service platforms in some form or another. And obviously the three big players in this market are AWS, Microsoft Azure, and the Google Cloud Platform. What's interesting is that globally, around 78% of enterprises actually use more than one of these platforms. And that's according to a recent report from Flexera. And then when we have large-scale adoption of cloud services, such as some of the things you see there, Office 365, ServiceNow, Salesforce, Workday, and of course, SAP S/4HANA, the migration from on-premise to these cloud services is really becoming mandatory for most organizations in order to remain competitive, supported, and current with their technology. And as we know, these are big, expensive projects, typically involving the transition of user access to the cloud, a cleanup of access rights along the way, planning of new role structures, and many other identity-related tasks, many of which are underestimated in lots of these programs. Again, having a governance system in place with a repository of identity cubes that defines the users, their relationship with the company, will greatly help these transitions. Automated provisioning processes, role mining and role governance tools, fast onboarding of applications into the governance solution will all help to speed up and simplify your secure move to the cloud. And finally, the last topic I wanted to touch on today, or the last of the challenges, is really the world of automation. And over the past few years, we've seen a huge wave in adoption of things like process automation, RPA, and an increase in the general use of bots and bot accounts. The potential impact of bots being used without any kind of appropriate identity governance is now significant, and it's become very recognized. Businesses should ask the right questions of their organizations and be on the lookout for automation programs that could be creating bots ad hoc across the enterprise. Being ahead of the curve is pretty much key to ensuring identity governance standards are met in this rush to be an early adopter. As these bot-based initiatives arise, businesses can really pave the way to success by using models for management that have already been proven. Most often, this will really mean treating bots and bot accounts in the same manner as we do contractor-based identities. Just like contractors today, this will require the establishment of a sub-repository of identity cubes that are dedicated to managing these bots. As bots are created or modified or eliminated, this repository must be updated and refreshed, just as we do with user accounts. And we must also consider things like time-based access and the application of policies and separation of duty checks to ensure tight restrictions on the capabilities of these bots within the environment. Any access to privileged information must be restricted through appropriate separation of duties. Any use of privileged accounts must be performed through proper channels, such as dedicated privileged access management solutions. Because their actions should be strictly within a set boundary, analytics may also be deployed to identify if the bot activity includes anything outside of its original intended function. And additionally, human oversight of these bot accounts is critical to good governance, meaning that every bot, like a contractor, must have a real-world person who is ultimately responsible for their governance. This is a real-life application of inter-cube relationships. So SailPoint really believes that identity should be at the heart of an organization's IT and business and security strategy in order to maintain effective governance, reduce risk, and protect the organization from information exposure. However, identity also has a part to play in addressing the broader security risk and compliance requirements in most organizations. Why not integrate this identity knowledge with your IT applications, your services, your security infrastructure components, so they can all benefit from this value stored in the identity cube itself? Typically, many of the security solutions become silos, they're operated and managed by different groups, and they tend to have a very specific focus. And this is really where identity can help. By sharing identity cubes across these information silos, we can enhance our effectiveness. If we give each of these areas a common understanding of who should have access, who does actually have access today, and how they should be using that access, we can break down the silos and make the whole security proposition more effective. And the same information can help the company to become more agile and address these challenges of transformative IT that we've talked about, while maintaining the highest level of control possible over both the people and the information in our organizations. So thank you all for listening. That concludes our SailPoint presentation for today. We hope, or I hope you enjoyed the session and found it educational. And as Chris mentioned at the start, we now have some time for Q&A if there are any questions.
So thanks very much, Mark. That was a great insight into how best to get a holistic view of access across your entire landscape. I mean, you talked about some specific challenges there that apply to all organisations, regardless of market. I mean, you touched on the insider threat, which is, every organisation has, which are, legitimate users who have somehow accidentally lost their credentials to cyber threat actors and therefore pose a risk. So the access that they have across the organisation obviously needs to be limited, because that then limits the damage that a threat actor can do. Most companies also, we touched upon the digital transformations. So I mean, most organisations have some form of digital transformation in progress, and now much more, the position of moving to the cloud. And in the context of the pandemic, remote working and the speed of productivity the speed and productivity over security. I mean, data for me is now the lifeblood of any organisation, so its loss can be absolutely devastating. The other things are around JML processes, so you join and move the levers, usually manual and time consuming, especially across the hundreds of applications typical organisations have. And you did mention orphan accounts. So these are accounts that are left over in systems that don't correspond to people. So as people leave the organisation, if that leaver process isn't in place, then accounts may be left over and active. For people who have left the organisation, and then those accounts pose a risk should they be breached. And I think one of the key things for me is not having that single view of access across the entire landscape. Not only on premise but also on the cloud. That's one of the key things and key challenges that we spoke about earlier. So, I mean, I hope that resonates well with everyone on the call. It seems like that we do have a number of questions that you've been sending through. So we do have a few minutes to answer some of your questions, although, as I said before, we've got a limited amount of time. So any that we don't get to, we will take offline and get back to you in due course. So let's have a look here. So the first question, Mark, can you explain in more detail how the IdentityCube repository can help transition from something like an on-premise HR system to, say, Workday?
Yeah, sure. Good question. So we sort of touched a little bit on the sort of digital transformation area. Really, when you get down to the detail of it, if we have an identity repository, we have information about all our users, the current access they require, and their relationship with the business, what job function they perform. Any system, such as moving from a on-premise HR to Workday or anything else, really, is simply a case of connecting the new system into that environment and using some of the automated tools to effectively help populate the new system into the cloud. Now, what you typically want to do if you were putting together a migration process to move to something like Workday, one of the tasks you would need to do is effectively understand who currently has access, probably go through and clean that access, remove the old accounts, remove any orphans, readdress the access rights, and use that information to populate the new environment. And once it's populated, without a governance system, it'll just run away with itself like applications do. What we're saying with if we have a governance system in place, we have that IdentityCube structure already. We've already done a lot of that work. We're constantly monitoring and checking and validating user access. We're dealing with staff movements, so we have a very good picture of what is in the current HR system. Implementing a new HR system is simply a case of copying, connecting that into the environment, adding the access requirements into probably into the role structure we already have, and literally watching the system populate that new environment, create the accounts, set the appropriate access rights, and we can use it to physically transition our users. But at the same time, we're keeping all the governance controls in place. So a mature governance environment like this is very valuable when we're doing any movement from one application to another, whether that's a wholesale cloud transformation or a simple migration between two pieces of technology. It has significant value there.
And I think it's worth mentioning as well, Mark, that when we talk about transition, there might be a scenario whereby both systems are live while the parts of the business migrate onto the new platform, and the identity cube can help facilitate that and keep both systems we can keep them both in sync, if you like.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, cool. So thanks for that. So we have another question here. Is the identity cube limited to what you can store in it? Or is it extensible?
Okay, yeah, another good question. Well, obviously, we provide, as part of the solutions, we provide a basic representation of what we would expect to be in the cube. And typically that is a set of identity attributes that describe the user, provide the unique identifiers and the relationship to the organization, and all that is pre-populated for the user. But absolutely, yes, it is extensible. In order to get the best out of these governance solutions, it has to be extensible, really, because you, as a user of governance, need to decide what you want to store in this structure. And yeah, there's no limits really as to what you want to put in there. So you can start adding in additional information. That might be information that is derived directly from existing data sources. It could be information that you effectively calculate or determine in real time. So again, we have the ability to generate data during the collection process as well. So yeah, it is extensible.
Brilliant, thank you. And it's probably worth saying, I guess just for everyone's benefit, that we've got the identity cube, which represents an identity or a bot. What you can do is you can extend the identity cube to contain a sort of business-friendly language. So if we think about access in a system, when you're asking users to kind of see if that access is appropriate, one of the things that one of the key sort of challenges that happens is that access is presented to them the same way that their system access might present it. So they're the roles and things are usually presented in a very, very tech type language. So what you can actually do is you can extend the identity cube and the governance platform to actually contain business friendly language. That when users are asked to carry out activities on as part of the governance activities, they're actually seeing what is a business friendly language rather than the underlying technology type language.
Yeah, good point.
So I think we're only going to have time for one more question. We have one here. You mentioned bot accounts. Is it a case of simply attaching these to the identity cube as a privileged account? And if so, what is the best practice for doing that? So I think this is, regarding if you have a bot, how do you kind of attach them back to the main identity?
Yeah, that's another good question. I think I mentioned in the presentation that we typically treat bots as contractors. They're effectively contract workers that arrive in the organization, they perform a function, and they then are switched off or terminated. So very similar to contractors. However, we typically do have best practice around bot management. What we absolutely don't want to do is identify the responsible human person and attach the bot to that person, and then something like the person decides to leave the organization or is terminated. We absolutely don't want the automated solutions to switch off our bot accounts, and that could have serious impact to the automated processes that we've deployed elsewhere in the organization. So typically we don't attach bots to existing human-based identity cubes. Typically we create specialized cubes purely for the bots themselves, and we implement cube-to-cube relationships to basically identify, almost like a reporting line, who is the administrative owner for this bot or this collection of bots. Is it an individual person? Is it a group of people? So we would typically have separate cubes to represent each of the bot identities. That means that we can then easily certify those, completely separate to the human identity cubes. We can apply policies purely that are applicable to bots, etc. So yeah, best practice is usually to have a specialized bot identity cubes really to manage those environments.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Mark. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our allotted time. We do have more questions from you, so thanks everyone for asking all those questions. Apologies that we didn't really get to them all. However, what we'll do is we'll take them offline and we'll respond individually to them. So we'll contact you separately with the answers to those questions. So I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and also Mark for an excellent session. Just a reminder that the sessions are available both online and demand, so you can rewatch them at your leisure. And just a brief mention that you can still register for the sessions that we have available tomorrow, which is our final day. So please feel free to do so. You can register right up to the start of the event. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me directly with the details that are on screen now. We hope you enjoyed this session and the rest of the conference. Thanks again for joining us today. Stay safe and have a great evening or rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.